5 Signs You've Outgrown Your Old Self. Vertical bar. Carl Jung's shocking truth about transformation. Have you ever felt like the person you once were no longer exists? You wake up one day realizing the things that used to matter now feel meaningless. You're not broken, you're evolving. Carl Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." This is what happens when you outgrow your old self, when your soul begins to shed the masks, the fears, and the stories that once defined you. In this video, we'll explore the 5 powerful signs you've outgrown your old self, the moments that mark the death of who you were and the rebirth of who you're meant to be. Part 1. The death of the old identity. When the ego starts to crumble. There comes a point in every soul's evolution when the identity you once carried begins to collapse under its own weight. Everything that once felt stable starts to lose its meaning. Your job, your relationships, your ambitions, even the version of yourself you used to admire. It's as though the very ground beneath your personality gives way. Carl Jung described this psychological earthquake as the moment the ego, the small self that believes it controls your life, begins to die. In Jungian psychology, this is not a literal death, but a necessary disintegration. The ego, which has been built over years from social conditioning, expectations, and roles, begins to fall apart because it can no longer contain the expanding consciousness that is emerging from within. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the process through which a person moves from being a product of external influence to becoming a conscious, authentic being, connected to the self, the divine center of the psyche. When this process starts, you might feel like you're losing your mind. But in truth, what's happening is the loss of the false mind, the personality mask that once protected you but now limits your growth. This is the death of the old identity, and it often comes disguised as emotional chaos, existential crisis, or deep fatigue with life as you know it. 1. The disintegration of the false self. The first sign that you've outgrown your old self is a quiet but undeniable sense that your life no longer fits you. You begin to see through the illusions that used to guide you: success, approval, validation, status. The roles you once played no longer bring satisfaction. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The old self is the collection of these unconscious patterns, learned fears, inherited behaviors, and the persona you crafted to be accepted. But as your consciousness expands, the unconscious begins to reveal itself. Suddenly, you're confronted with truths you can no longer ignore, that you've been living not from your essence, but from survival. This is when the old identity starts to dissolve. You may feel detached from things you used to care deeply about, or experience a sudden aversion to environments that once felt normal. You might even withdraw from people you love, not out of resentment, but because something deeper inside you can no longer pretend. This stage feels like emotional death, yet it is the seed of rebirth. It's the same pattern found in nature. A snake sheds its skin not because it wants to, but because staying in the old one becomes suffocating. Similarly, your psyche must break apart the ego's shell to make space for something larger, the self. The more you resist this disintegration, the more painful it becomes. But the more you surrender to it, the clearer your new direction becomes. 2. The dark night of the soul. Jung's work parallels the mystic tradition's concept of the dark night of the soul, a phase where the light of your old consciousness fades before a new one is born. It's a time when external success loses its meaning and inner emptiness takes over. You might feel invisible, forgotten by life, or abandoned by God. Yet this emptiness is not punishment, it is purification. Your soul is being stripped of attachments that no longer serve its evolution. Jung observed that the psyche always strives toward wholeness, even if that means breaking down what was once stable. The dark night happens when your inner world is being reorganized, when the unconscious begins to flood the surface, forcing you to confront the shadows you've long ignored. You might notice patterns of self-sabotage resurfacing, emotional triggers intensifying, or a deep loneliness that seems to echo from the center of your being. These are not regressions, they are revelations, The psyche exposes what must die so that something higher can live. During this phase, many people confuse spiritual awakening with depression because both feel like collapse. But there is a subtle difference. Depression drains your energy, while awakening consumes it for transformation. Depression wants to end the pain. Awakening wants to understand it. The difference lies in awareness. One resists, the other observes. The dark night ends when you stop trying to fix yourself and start listening. When you stop asking, "How do I get out of this?" and begin asking, "What is this trying to show me?" 3. Losing interest in what once defined you. As the old identity dissolves, you begin to lose interest in many things that used to define your personality. The people, goals, and pleasures that once motivated you now feel hollow. Jung would say that the libido, the psychic energy that once flowed into external pursuits, is being redirected inward. This is why, during psychological transformation, many people experience what seems like a loss of passion or purpose. It's not that life has lost its meaning, it's that the old meanings no longer satisfy the deeper hunger of your soul. You might stop chasing external achievements because you sense that no accomplishment can fill the inner void. In this stage, you might appear distant or unmotivated to others. They might say, "You've changed," as if that's something bad. But what they really mean is, you no longer fit into the version of reality that we share. This can lead to loneliness as the outer world mirrors back your internal transformation. Jung taught that individuation often begins with isolation because solitude creates the space for the true self to speak. The withdrawal from old patterns isn't a regression, it's preparation. You're gathering psychic energy for the next stage of evolution. 4. Emotional turbulence as a path to awareness. When the ego begins to lose control, emotions intensify. Anger, sadness, confusion, nostalgia, all of them rise to the surface like waves. Jung described this as the confrontation with the shadow, the repressed parts of ourselves that were buried to maintain the old identity. The ego's collapse exposes what it was protecting you from: unhealed pain, shame, guilt, and fear. Yet paradoxically, this emotional chaos is evidence of healing. It's the psyche cleansing itself through feeling. You might start questioning your entire life. Who am I if I'm not this job, this relationship, this belief? These questions, though painful, are sacred. Jung believed that only through confronting the shadow can we move toward wholeness. The shadow is not evil, it's the unlived potential of the soul. Facing it is the price of maturity. This emotional breakdown is a spiritual initiation. It teaches humility, the recognition that you are not your achievements or traumas, but the awareness behind them. When you begin to feel everything deeply without labeling it as good or bad, you start to awaken the witness within the part of you that observes without judgment. That witness is the seed of your true self. 5. The ego's last defense: resistance and fear. Before the old self dies completely, it will fight to survive. Jung warned that the ego does not surrender easily. It uses fear, guilt, and doubt to pull you back into old patterns. It tells you that you're losing control, that change is dangerous, that the unknown will destroy you. This inner resistance is natural. After all, the ego's purpose is to preserve identity, but growth requires letting go of certainty. The more you resist the call to evolve, the stronger your inner suffering becomes. Jung noted that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In other words, when you avoid the necessary pain of transformation, you create unnecessary suffering. To outgrow your old self, you must face this fear consciously. You have to let the ego die without dying with it. That means acknowledging that what once worked for you no longer does, that the old strategies of control, approval-seeking, and perfection are no longer sustainable. This surrender is not weakness, it's trust. Trust that the deeper intelligence of the psyche knows where it's leading you. When you stop fighting the disintegration, you allow the self, the divine center, to emerge naturally. 6. The symbolic death and rebirth. In Jungian terms, every major transformation involves a symbolic death. This death is the destruction of an outdated psychic structure. Jung often illustrated this through mythological imagery: the hero's descent into the underworld, the crucifixion before resurrection, the phoenix burning before rising from its ashes. To outgrow your old self means to go through this symbolic death consciously. It's not about becoming someone new, but remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. You stop identifying with the surface and begin connecting with the essence. When you reach this level of awareness, pain becomes your teacher. Instead of asking why it's happening, you begin to ask what it's revealing. You realize that every loss was an initiation, every failure a mirror, showing you the limits of your old consciousness. You begin to see your life as a psychological alchemy, where suffering is the fire that purifies and consciousness is the gold that emerges. 7. The subtle signs of inner maturity. The death of the old identity doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, cyclical process of breaking and rebuilding. But there are subtle signs that you are entering this new phase of consciousness. You no longer chase validation. You seek truth. You feel less reactive and more reflective. You prefer solitude over superficiality. You stop explaining yourself to people who refuse to understand. You begin to sense an inner peace even when life is uncertain. These are not changes on the surface, but deep shifts in vibration. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of life is not happiness, but wholeness. When you begin to integrate your light and shadow, your masculine and feminine, your conscious and unconscious, that's when you begin to live from your center. The collapse of the old self is therefore not a tragedy, but a sacred initiation. You are being stripped of illusion so that you can embody truth. The first sign that you've outgrown your old self, then, is this profound psychological death, the dismantling of your ego identity and the surrender to something deeper. It feels like loss, but it is liberation. What dies is the mask. What's born is the soul. Part 2. The awakening of the inner observer, when you no longer identify with your past. When you begin to awaken from the dream of your old self, the first shift is subtle but life-altering. You start to observe your thoughts instead of being consumed by them. You notice your emotions without drowning in them. You begin to sense that there's a part of you watching everything calmly, quietly, untouched by chaos. That silent witness is what Carl Jung called the self, the center of the psyche that transcends the ego and connects you to something eternal. This stage marks the awakening of the inner observer, the moment when you no longer identify with the story of who you were. It's not that your past disappears, it's that you stop mistaking it for your identity. The suffering, shame, and roles that once defined you become like chapters you've read rather than the book you're still living in. Jung saw this as the emergence of consciousness, the realization that the ego, which once claimed to be you, is only a small fragment of a much greater whole. 1. The separation between the ego and the self. In the early stages of human development, the ego is the ruler of the inner world. It defines itself by doing, achieving, and controlling. It builds an identity based on experiences and reactions. I am what I've done. I am what others say about me. But as consciousness evolves, a fracture occurs within the psyche, not a wound, but a sacred separation. You begin to perceive the difference between the voice of the ego and the presence of the self. Jung described this separation as the birth of individuation, the process of becoming aware of one's inner totality. When you start to witness your own mind, you realize that thoughts arise and disappear without your control. Emotions come and go like weather, yet something remains constant, the observer behind it all. That observer is not your personality, it's your essence. This moment of awareness is the beginning of psychological freedom. You no longer mistake every fleeting emotion as truth. You can feel sadness without becoming it. You can sense anger without letting it define you. You can see fear without obeying it. Jung saw this as the transformation from ego consciousness to self-awareness, a fundamental expansion of perspective. When this shift happens, life slows down. You stop reacting impulsively to every external trigger. You see your thoughts as objects in the field of awareness, not as commands you must follow. This detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. The self doesn't reject emotion, it integrates it. 2. The ego's resistance to observation. The moment you begin to observe the ego, it resists. The ego cannot survive being watched because observation exposes its illusions. The ego lives through identification. I am angry, I am jealous, I am a failure. But when you observe, you start to realize, I am not anger, I am the one who sees the anger. This shift terrifies the ego. It feels like death because the ego's power depends on your belief that it is you. So it fights back through distraction, defensiveness, and self-doubt. You'll notice moments where you awaken into awareness, then suddenly fall back into old habits, scrolling endlessly, overthinking, arguing with yourself. That oscillation is normal. Jung noted that the psyche moves through cycles of inflation and deflation, moments when the ego expands, then collapses back into humility as it faces the vastness of the unconscious. The key is to continue observing without judgment. Awareness itself is the transformation. You don't need to destroy the ego, you need to understand it. Jung often said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The ego is that darkness when it goes unseen. When you observe it, you bring light into it. The inner observer, therefore, is not a passive witness, but an active illuminator. Every time you notice a pattern, a recurring reaction, a story you tell yourself, a projection you cast on others, you dissolve a piece of unconsciousness. You stop being controlled by the past because you can now see it operating within you. 3. Seeing through the stories of the past. One of the most liberating signs that you've outgrown your old self is the realization that your past no longer has the same grip on you. You remember it, but you no longer relive it. You can revisit old memories without being pulled into their emotional gravity. This detachment doesn't mean suppression, it means integration. The ego thrives on story. It constantly refers to what happened, who hurt you, who abandoned you, who failed you, because that narrative gives it identity. Jung saw this as the trap of the personal unconscious, where people become prisoners of their own history. But when the inner observer awakens, you realize that your past was not punishment or proof of unworthiness, it was material for consciousness. Each painful event becomes a symbol rather than a scar. The betrayal becomes the lesson of discernment. The failure becomes the awakening of humility. The loss becomes the revelation of impermanence. You stop asking, why did this happen to me, and start seeing, what did this awaken in me? Jung often drew parallels between this process and alchemy, the transformation of base matter into gold. The alchemist was not literally turning metal into gold, but transforming unconscious suffering into wisdom. Likewise, when you observe your past without attachment, you extract the gold of consciousness from the lead of experience. This shift changes everything. You stop identifying as the victim of your story and start recognizing yourself as its author. You understand that the person you once were served a purpose, but that version of you no longer needs to run the show. 4. The mirror of projection. As your awareness expands, you start to see how much of your perception of others was never about them, but about you. Jung's concept of projection explains that the unconscious constantly throws parts of itself onto the outer world. The traits you despise in others are often the ones you haven't accepted in yourself. The people you idealize reflect your own disowned potential. When the inner observer awakens, you begin to reclaim these projections. You notice how easily the mind creates stories, how you label someone as toxic, selfish, or superior, not realizing that each label reveals a piece of your shadow. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This realization can be uncomfortable. You start to see how you unconsciously created many of your own conflicts. But it's also empowering because once you see the projection, you can withdraw it. Instead of blaming others for your emotional reactions, you trace them inward. You ask, What in me is being reflected here? This is one of the most advanced stages of self-awareness, the recognition that everyone in your life is part of your psychological mirror. Each person, pleasant or painful, reveals something about your inner architecture. The people you clash with show you the boundaries you need. The ones who trigger you show you the wounds still open. The ones you love deeply show you the parts of yourself you're finally ready to embrace. The awakening of the inner observer makes relationships sacred laboratories of consciousness. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to expand awareness rather than reinforce the ego's story. 5. The shift from reaction to response. When you live from the ego, you react automatically. Someone insults you, and you retaliate. Life challenges you, and you panic. But when the inner observer awakens, there's a gap, a moment of stillness between stimulus and response. In that space, freedom lives. This is where real transformation begins. You realize that no one controls your inner state unless you allow them to. Jung believed that psychological maturity is measured by your ability to stay conscious in moments of emotional intensity. The ability to pause, to breathe, to watch the rising storm inside you without acting from it, that is mastery. This doesn't mean repression. You still feel deeply. But instead of letting emotion possess you, you allow it to move through you. You might say to yourself, I feel anger right now. I will not suppress it, but I will not let it dictate my behavior. That awareness dissolves half of its power. The ego thrives on impulsivity. The self thrives on awareness. The more you practice this observation, the less chaotic your inner world becomes. You start noticing patterns, the same argument, repeating with different people, the same insecurity showing up in different forms. This repetition is not punishment. It's the psyche's way of saying, learn the lesson. Once you learn, the pattern dissolves. 6. The collapse of identification. When you no longer identify with your thoughts, emotions, or roles, the ego panics. It whispers, if I'm not these things, then who am I? That question marks the true beginning of spiritual maturity. In Jungian language, this is the ego's confrontation with the self, the realization that the I it has always believed in is not the totality of being. The ego is like the moon reflecting the sun's light. It has no illumination of its own. When you awaken the observer, you begin to see the sun, the self that has always been shining behind the mental clouds. This collapse of identification can feel disorienting. You might experience temporary loss of motivation, confusion about your purpose, or even a sense of emptiness. Jung described this as the transcendent function where opposing parts of the psyche, the conscious and unconscious, begin to merge into a higher unity. It's like a psychological metamorphosis, the caterpillar dissolving in the cocoon before becoming the butterfly. The old identity based on trauma conditioning and social labels dissolves into formless awareness. This is not annihilation, it's expansion. You stop being a somebody trying to control everything and start being consciousness experiencing everything. This shift can't be forced. It unfolds naturally as you continue to observe without judgment. Over time, you begin to trust the intelligence of life itself, that the same force that makes the heart beat and the stars move is guiding your transformation. 7. Recognizing the voice of the self. Once the inner observer stabilizes, you begin to sense another voice within, quieter, wiser, and infinitely compassionate. It doesn't argue like the ego, it whispers. It doesn't rush. It guides. Jung believed that this voice is the self communicating through intuition and synchronicity. You start noticing patterns in your life, coincidences that feel too precise to be random. A book appears with the exact message you needed. A stranger says something that answers your inner question. These are not accidents. They are reflections of your increasing alignment with the self. When you live from the ego, you rely on control. When you live from the self, you rely on connection. You realize that life is not happening to you but through you. The observer and the observed begin to merge. Awareness becomes your natural state. In this state, peace no longer depends on circumstances. You can face uncertainty without collapsing. You can experience loss without losing yourself. You can love without attachment. Jung called this the realization of the self as the organizing principle of the psyche. It's the moment when your life becomes an expression of consciousness rather than a defense against fear. 8. Emotional detachment versus emotional presence. Many people misunderstand this awakening and confuse observation with emotional detachment. Jung warned against spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use awareness as an escape from feeling. The true inner observer does not suppress emotion. It allows emotion to exist fully within awareness. To observe anger without judgment is not to ignore it, but to understand its message. To feel grief consciously is to let it wash through without drowning you. Jung saw emotions as messengers from the unconscious, revealing what the mind cannot articulate. When you stay present with them, they integrate into consciousness. When you resist them, they become neuroses. So awakening the inner observer doesn't make you cold, it makes you authentic. You feel everything but nothing owns you. You can cry without shame, love without fear, and let go without resentment. This is what Jung meant by the union of opposites, the merging of emotion and awareness into wholeness. 9. The shadows return in awareness. Even as you awaken, the shadow doesn't disappear. In fact, it becomes more visible. The more conscious you become, the more you see your hidden motives, manipulations, and fears. This can be uncomfortable, but it's proof of growth. Jung emphasized that enlightenment is not the absence of darkness, but the capacity to hold it in awareness. The awakened observer doesn't reject the shadow, it studies it. It says, here is my jealousy, here is my pride, here is my fear of rejection, and by observing it transforms them from enemies into teachers. You begin to see how each shadow element contains energy you once repressed: creative power, assertiveness, sensitivity, or vulnerability. Integrating these qualities makes you whole. The inner observer becomes the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, turning conflict into cooperation. This stage can bring profound humility. You realize that everyone carries the same human contradictions. The person who triggers you most becomes your greatest mirror. The shadow in others shows the shadow in you. Awareness dissolves judgment and replaces it with understanding. 10. Living as awareness. Eventually, observing becomes effortless. You no longer have to remind yourself to stay present. Presence becomes your default. You wake up in the morning with a quiet mind. You engage with the world without losing yourself in it. You experience emotions deeply, yet they pass like waves on the surface of an infinite sea. Jung described this as the union of consciousness and the unconscious, the state of inner harmony where the self directs life instead of the ego. You begin to see meaning in everything. The mundane becomes mystical because you recognize that consciousness pervades all experience. In this state, you don't need to prove, fix, or chase. You simply are. You act not from fear or desire, but from alignment. The observer and the observed are one. Life becomes a dance between stillness and movement, awareness and form. You realize that your past was never your prison, but your path. Every wound was an initiation into wisdom. Every ending was an opening into awareness. The person you once were was necessary for you to become the one who sees. Shi. Practical signs of the inner observer's awakening. This transformation may sound abstract, but it shows up in daily life in tangible ways. You stop taking things personally, realizing others act from their own unconsciousness. You no longer feel the need to win every argument. Understanding becomes more valuable than being right. You find beauty in simplicity: a walk, silence, a cup of tea. Your inner dialogue softens. The critic becomes the companion. You start choosing peace over drama, presence over distraction. Time feels different, slower, richer, more alive. You become less reactive, more intentional. You sense synchronicity guiding your steps, as if life itself has become cooperative. These are not behavioral changes, they're signs of inner evolution. The old self lived in tension. The new awareness moves with grace. 12. The endless nature of awakening. Awakening the inner observer is not a destination, but a continual unfolding. Even Jung admitted that individuation, the process of becoming whole, lasts a lifetime. There will be moments when the ego resurfaces, when old wounds reopen, when awareness fades. But each return to observation deepens the understanding that consciousness is infinite. The more you awaken, the less you chase transcendence. You stop seeking experiences of bliss and start appreciating the ordinary miracle of awareness itself. You begin to realize that everything you were searching for, peace, love, fulfillment, was not outside you but within the one who observes. Awakening doesn't make you superhuman, it makes you profoundly human. You become intimate with life, feeling its fragility and beauty simultaneously. You laugh at your old seriousness. You forgive your past because you finally understand it. The observer within you has no age, gender, or name. It's the timeless presence that watched you grow, suffer, and evolve. It's the same awareness that looked through your eyes when you were a child and still looks through them now. This is the self that Jung devoted his life to exploring, the divine center of being. When you awaken to it, you realize that you were never broken, only unconscious. The journey was never about becoming more. It was about remembering what was always there. Part 3. The conflict between who you were and who you're becoming. Carl Jung analysis. There comes a moment in every transformation where the soul finds itself caught between two worlds, the life that once defined you and the emerging life that no longer fits inside that old definition. This psychological tension is not merely emotional confusion, it is a fundamental feature of inner evolution. Carl Jung called it the tension of opposites, a creative struggle between the conscious and the unconscious, the ego and the self, the past and the potential. In this stage, you live in the space between who you used to be and who you are becoming. You're not fully the old version of yourself anymore yet. The new version has not entirely solidified. This is an identity limbo, uncomfortable, unpredictable, and necessary. Jung described this as the crucible, where the transcendent function emerges, the birth of something higher that reconciles the conflict. But before that reconciliation comes, the psyche must endure the battle, the internal war between old habits, fears, attachments, and the new consciousness demanding to be born. 1. The psychological war within. As you begin to evolve, the parts of you that were built on survival resist the change. The ego, once the center of control, senses that it's losing its authority. It begins to defend itself by resurrecting old patterns, familiar emotions, and outdated identities. You might notice yourself swinging between clarity and confusion one day, feeling liberated the next, doubting everything. You start to see glimpses of your higher potential, but your mind still clings to the safety of the known. Jung described this as psychic ambivalence, when two opposing forces pull the psyche in different directions, creating inner friction. That friction is not failure, it's the energy of transformation itself. Jung believed that without tension there can be no consciousness. The psyche evolves by holding opposites together until a new synthesis emerges. So the war between the old and new self is not a sign of regression, it is proof that evolution is underway. You might feel like two people living in the same body. One part still seeks validation, comfort, and control. The other craves authenticity, freedom, and truth. The conflict between them can manifest as anxiety, restlessness, or even exhaustion. But these symptoms are not illnesses, they are indicators that the psyche is in motion, reshaping itself around a new center. 2. The collapse of old values. Every identity is structured around a value system, what you think is important, desirable, or worth pursuing. When you start to outgrow your old self, these values begin to lose their meaning. What once motivated you, approval, status, belonging, now feels empty. You begin to question the rules you once lived by. Why did I need to please everyone? Why did I measure success by productivity? Why did I believe that love meant sacrifice? These questions destabilize the ego because they threaten the foundation upon which it was built. Jung wrote that the process of individuation requires the destruction of the collective illusion, the inherited beliefs of family culture and religion that once dictated who you should be. When those illusions collapse, the psyche enters a moral vacuum. You feel lost, not because you have no values, but because your soul is in the process of creating new ones. This collapse is often mistaken for failure or depression, but what's actually dying are the values that belong to the false self. The things that once gave you meaning no longer resonate because your consciousness has outgrown them. Jung compared this to a snake shedding its skin, a painful but necessary renewal. It's in this phase that many people experience existential anxiety, the realization that meaning must now come from within, not from external validation. You can't go back to the comfort of conformity, but you're not yet grounded in your individuality. You stand between worlds and the void in between feels endless. 3. The fear of losing the old self. Change always threatens identity. When you start to evolve, you don't just lose bad habits, you lose familiarity. The routines, beliefs, and people who once anchored you begin to drift away. The ego interprets this as death. Jung noted that every major transformation involves a symbolic death of the old personality. You might feel waves of nostalgia for your past self, the one who used to laugh more easily, who cared less about deeper questions, who lived according to predictable rhythms. There's a strange longing to return to ignorance because awareness feels heavy. But Jung emphasized that this mourning is a sacred part of the journey. To outgrow your old self is to lose the psychological home you once lived in. You're not weak for grieving it. You're human. The psyche must honor what it's leaving behind before it can move forward. Yet the ego resists by clinging harder. It whispers, "You're changing too much. People won't recognize you. You'll be alone." These fears are the ego's last defense mechanisms. They keep you attached to the identity that's dying. The key is to recognize this fear without obeying it. Transformation doesn't require you to destroy the old self violently. It asks you to let it dissolve naturally, like a cocoon giving way to the butterfly. The old you had a purpose, it got you here, but it cannot take you further. 4. The mirror of relationships. One of the clearest signs that you're in conflict between who you were and who you're becoming is how your relationships begin to shift. Jung explained that as we change internally, the outer world adjusts to mirror that inner transformation. You might notice that conversations that once excited you now feel shallow. People who used to understand you suddenly seem distant. Some relationships dissolve not because of betrayal, but because your vibration no longer aligns with theirs. This can be a deeply painful realization. The ego, which thrives on belonging, interprets these changes as rejection. But from the perspective of the self, it's not rejection, it's reconfiguration. The psyche is reorganizing your environment to reflect your new state of consciousness. During this time, projections also become more visible. You begin to see how much of your relationships were based on mutual illusions. You played a role and they played theirs. As you become more authentic, those dynamics collapse. Jung believed that genuine relationships can only exist between two individuated beings, two people who are not enslaved by their shadows or dependent on each other for identity. As you grow, your relationships either evolve with you or fall away. This natural pruning makes space for deeper connections built on truth rather than comfort. 5. The emergence of inner conflict as a catalyst. It's natural to wish for peace during transformation, but Jung argued that inner conflict is not something to eliminate, it's something to integrate. Consciousness grows through friction. When two parts of the psyche are at war, the one that wants to stay safe and the one that wants to evolve, that tension generates energy. This energy fuels the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism through which a new, higher state of awareness is born. You cannot become your true self without confronting your divided self. The fear, confusion, and contradictions you feel are raw materials for transformation. Jung compared this to alchemy, the process of turning base matter instinct, fear, desire into spiritual gold, awareness, authenticity, wisdom. Every conflict is an invitation to integrate opposites to find balance between strength and sensitivity, action and reflection, love and independence. The goal is not to choose one side, but to hold both consciously until a third, higher perspective emerges. That's why Jung often said, hold the tension of the opposites. When you can sit with contradiction without collapsing into despair or denial, you become a vessel for transformation. 6. The shadow's interference. As you move forward, your shadow, the unconscious aspects of yourself you've rejected, rises to the surface. It tries to pull you back into familiar patterns because it associates familiarity with safety. You might suddenly feel tempted to repeat old behaviors, self-sabotage, overthinking, emotional dependency, or seeking approval. It's not regression, it's exposure. The shadow emerges precisely when you're strong enough to face it. Jung believed that the shadow must not be destroyed but integrated. It contains not only your darkness but also your unused potential. Within the shadow live your repressed courage, creativity, sensuality, and individuality. Facing it brings these qualities into consciousness. This confrontation is often uncomfortable because it challenges your self-image. You must admit that you're not only light but also capable of deceit, envy, or arrogance. But only by acknowledging these parts can you transcend them. Denying the shadow keeps you fragmented. Embracing it makes you whole. As you become more self-aware, you realize that growth is not about becoming pure, it's about becoming complete. 7. The silence before integration. After periods of intense inner conflict, there often comes an eerie calm. It feels like emptiness, like standing in the ruins of your old self with no idea what comes next. But Jung explained that this silence is the space in which the new consciousness gestates. The psyche, after so much chaos, needs rest to reorganize. It's similar to how nature pauses after a storm. The soil needs stillness before it can bloom again. Many people mistake this stillness for stagnation, but it's actually integration. During this time, you may lose interest in external pursuits and feel drawn inward. Solitude becomes medicine. In that silence, you begin to sense faint whispers of a new direction, not from your mind, but from your soul. Jung referred to this as the voice of the self, the organizing center of the psyche that knows where you're going even when the ego doesn't. The self doesn't shout. It guides through intuition, synchronicity, and resonance. To hear it, you must become quiet enough to listen. 8. The transformation of desire. As you transition from the old self to the new, your desires begin to change. You no longer crave validation but authenticity. You no longer seek comfort but alignment. What used to excite you now bores you, and what once scared you now intrigues you. Jung saw desire as the compass of the soul. When purified by awareness, it reveals your deepest calling. The problem is not desire itself, but unconscious desire, the kind driven by fear, comparison, or compensation. When the inner observer from part 2 has awakened, you begin to see through these false cravings. You understand that what you truly seek is not external achievement, but internal coherence. The feeling of being whole, present, and true to yourself. This shift can create a temporary identity crisis because the ego, deprived of its old goals, doesn't know what to pursue. But this is exactly how the self takes over, by replacing ambition with purpose. Instead of striving, you start aligning. Instead of chasing, you start creating from authenticity. 9. The battle between surrender and control. One of the hardest parts of transformation is learning to surrender. The ego is addicted to control. It wants to manage the process, to predict outcomes, to make the new self appear on its own schedule. But the evolution of consciousness cannot be controlled. It unfolds organically. Jung emphasized that the psyche is self-regulating, meaning it knows how to restore balance when left undisturbed. The problem is that the ego interferes, trying to speed up or resist what's natural. The result is suffering. You may feel torn between trusting the process and forcing clarity, One part of you says, let go. The other says, I need answers now. That tug of war is normal. The key is to recognize that surrender doesn't mean passivity. It means cooperation with a higher intelligence. Surrender is when you finally accept that you cannot think your way into transformation, you can only allow it. You don't need to know what's coming. You need to stay conscious enough to meet it. The paradox of growth is that the more you try to control it, the more you delay it. But when you allow the process to unfold, life starts aligning in ways the ego could never plan. This is what Jung meant by synchronicity, the mysterious alignment between the inner and outer world that arises when you're in harmony with your true path. 10. The integration of duality. Eventually, the inner war softens. You realize that the conflict between who you were and who you're becoming was never a battle to be won, but a dance to be understood. The old self is not your enemy, it's your foundation. The new self is not your replacement, it's your expansion. Jung taught that transformation doesn't destroy, it integrates. The goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness, the ability to hold opposites within one consciousness. You learn to accept that you can be both confident and uncertain, strong and vulnerable, human and divine. As these dualities reconcile within you, you experience a new kind of peace, not the absence of struggle, but the harmony of opposites. You begin to see that every contradiction was part of your education in consciousness. The conflict between your past and your potential becomes the bridge between them. You stop asking, when will this end, and start realizing, this is the process. 11. The signs that integration is near. When the psyche starts integrating the old and new self, subtle yet profound changes appear. You stop needing external approval to validate your path. You become less reactive to the opinions of others. You can look at your past without shame or nostalgia. You start valuing depth over speed, meaning over achievement. You no longer chase closure, you create peace from within. You can hold paradoxes without confusion. You begin to sense that life, even in uncertainty, is on your side. These are signs that the transcendent function, the alchemical union of opposites, is taking root. The storm has not ended, but you've learned to navigate it consciously. You're no longer driven by your old identity, nor are you enslaved by the need to define the new one. You simply allow life to express itself through you. 12. The self emerges through the conflict. Jung believed that the purpose of inner conflict is to birth the self, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, human and divine. The ego is not destroyed in this process. It becomes a servant of the self rather than its master. The new self that emerges is not someone else, it's you without illusion. It's the part of you that existed before conditioning, before trauma, before fear. It's not about becoming perfect, but becoming real. The moment you stop identifying solely with the war inside you, you start to realize that you are not the conflict. You are the awareness in which the conflict occurs. And that awareness, untouched by past or future, is your truest self. Part 4. Integration and rebirth when you start living as your true self. When the storm of transformation settles, something extraordinary begins to emerge. Not a new mask or an improved version of your old self, but a deeper, more authentic consciousness that was always there, waiting to be uncovered. This is the phase of integration and rebirth, where all the fragments of your psyche, your shadow, your wounds, your dreams, your contradictions begin to align under the organizing power of the self, the divine center of the personality that Carl Jung described as the totality of your being. This is not a moment of triumph, but of profound simplicity. You no longer strive to become someone, you start to live as yourself. The need to prove, justify, or perform fades, replaced by a quiet confidence rooted in inner wholeness. The journey through suffering was never about breaking you. It was about breaking everything that was not you. 1. The moment of psychological integration. Jung believed that the human psyche seeks balance above all. After the chaos of disintegration and inner conflict, the psyche naturally begins to reorganize itself. This stage integration is when the conscious and unconscious aspects of your personality start to harmonize. The conscious mind finally accepts what it once denied: the flaws, fears, and desires that live in the shadow. Instead of suppressing them, you integrate them. You recognize that darkness is not your enemy, but your depth. Your shadow transforms from something you fight against into something you understand and even respect. Integration means that you stop rejecting parts of yourself. You begin to see your anger as a signal for boundaries, your sadness as proof of compassion, your fear as a teacher of humility. You no longer split your psyche into good and bad parts. You realize that both serve your wholeness. Jung said one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That consciousness is now your foundation. This internal unity produces a kind of psychological gravity, a sense of coherence and authenticity. You no longer feel like a fragmented collection of roles. You're not one person at work and another with friends. You are the same essence everywhere. That consistency creates peace. You live in integrity because you no longer need to wear masks. 2. The emergence of the self as inner authority. Throughout life, most people are ruled by external authority: parents, teachers, religion, social norms. The ego builds its identity around those rules. But when the self begins to lead, authority shifts inward. You no longer seek permission to exist. The self becomes the center of your moral compass. Jung described this as the realization that true guidance comes from within through symbols, intuition, and synchronicities. Instead of obeying the outer world blindly, you listen to the subtle movements of your inner world. This doesn't make you rebellious for the sake of rebellion. It makes you discerning. You no longer follow trends or conform to expectations that contradict your truth. You can respect external systems without surrendering your individuality. Jung called this psychological sovereignty, the point where the self, not the ego, becomes the ruling principle of your life. You begin to sense that life itself is in conversation with you. Every event, every coincidence carries meaning. The universe mirrors your state of consciousness. Jung referred to this as synchronicity, the mysterious alignment between inner experience and outer reality. It's not magic, it's coherence. When the self governs your life, your inner and outer worlds fall into harmony. 3. The maturity of consciousness. Integration is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of maturity. Jung often said that the second half of life should not be lived according to the principles of the first. The first half is about building the ego, success, identity structure. The second half is about transcending it, meaning, purpose, soul. When you reach this stage, you no longer chase excitement, you seek depth. You value silence as much as expression. You no longer react to everything that happens. You respond from awareness. The frantic desire to control life transforms into trust in its unfolding. Jung compared this stage to the process of ripening. The fruit no longer grows outward but inward. Consciousness deepens rather than expands. You begin to recognize that life's purpose was never external achievement, but inner realization to become fully conscious of who and what you are. This maturity brings emotional stability. You still feel pain, but it no longer defines you. You experience fear, but you don't obey it. You feel joy, but you don't cling to it. There's a quiet rhythm in your being, an inner stillness that remains regardless of outer circumstances. 4. The union of opposites. The hallmark of psychological integration is the union of opposites, the reconciliation of dualities that once tore you apart. You no longer see life as a battle between good and bad, success and failure, light and dark. You begin to perceive wholeness. Jung saw the psyche as a self-regulating system that seeks equilibrium. When one extreme dominates, perfectionism, victimhood, denial, the unconscious compensates by manifesting its opposite. Integration means becoming conscious of both poles and holding them in awareness until a higher synthesis emerges. You realize you can be both strong and gentle, rational and intuitive, spiritual and earthly. You no longer reject any polarity because you understand that opposites create balance. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psychic mechanism that births new consciousness from tension. This realization changes how you see everything. You stop labeling experiences as mistakes. You see how every setback contained wisdom. You no longer run from discomfort because you understand it as fuel for growth. Life stops being a problem to solve and becomes a mystery to experience. 5. The end of psychological projection. During earlier stages of growth, you saw the world through projection, attributing your own unconscious qualities to others. But once you integrate your shadow, those projections begin to dissolve. You start seeing people as they are, not as mirrors of your unresolved issues. This change revolutionizes your relationships. You no longer expect others to complete you or heal your wounds. You no longer idolize or demonize anyone. You understand that everyone is struggling with their own unconscious material. Compassion replaces judgment. Jung explained that projection is a natural process. It's how the psyche externalizes what it can't face internally. But once you've made the unconscious, conscious projection becomes unnecessary. You withdraw your energy from illusions and reclaim it as creative power. You start relating to others from authenticity, not need. Love becomes freer, friendship, deeper boundaries, healthier. You don't lose yourself in others, nor do you isolate. You participate in life with awareness. You no longer seek connection out of loneliness, but out of abundance. 6. Living in harmony with the shadow integration doesn't mean you eliminate your shadow, it means you establish a relationship with it. You learn to sense when it's active, when your ego feels threatened, when envy arises, when control returns, and instead of condemning it, you listen. Jung believed that the shadow continues to accompany us throughout life. It's not something to overcome once and for all, but something to dance with consciously. When you live in harmony with your shadow, it becomes a source of vitality rather than destruction. For example, your anger becomes the energy that defends your boundaries. Your jealousy reveals where you've denied your own potential. Your fear becomes a compass showing where growth awaits. The shadow is no longer a prison, it's the map of your authenticity. This ongoing dialogue between light and dark keeps your consciousness alive. Jung wrote that life needs both sun and night to grow. To deny either is to deny the full spectrum of being human. 7. The rebirth of creativity and purpose. Once the psyche integrates the liberated energy that was once trapped in repression and conflict, returns as creativity. Jung saw creativity not as talent, but as the natural expression of a balanced psyche. When the conscious and unconscious cooperate, new ideas, insights, and inspirations flow effortlessly. This is why, after deep inner work, people often feel called to create, to write, paint, teach, build, heal, or nurture. It's not ambition, it's overflow. The soul finally has space to express its essence. Purpose also becomes clearer, not because you intellectually decide it, but because it emerges from your being. You no longer ask, "What should I do?" but rather, "What wants to move through me?" Life becomes participatory. You are both the artist and the canvas. Jung believed that creativity is a sacred duty, the individual's contribution to the collective unconscious. By living authentically, you add new symbols, new meaning to the world's evolving story. This is how consciousness evolves, one awakened individual at a time. 8. The sacred role of suffering. When you look back, you begin to see your suffering differently. What once felt cruel now appears purposeful. Each wound was a portal to consciousness. Each heartbreak was a teacher. Each loss stripped away illusion. Jung taught that the path to wholeness is paved with suffering because pain forces awareness. The ego would never voluntarily surrender control, only through crisis does it finally yield. Suffering breaks the shell of identity so that the self can emerge. You stop resenting the darkness and start thanking it. You realize that pain was never punishment, it was initiation. Without the breaking, there could be no opening. Without descent, no ascent. This realization brings gratitude even for the difficult parts of your journey. You understand that every experience, no matter how painful, contributed to your awakening. You no longer wish things had been easier. You see that the struggle shaped your soul's depth. 9. The simplicity of being. When integration deepens, life becomes astonishingly simple. Not because everything is easy, but because you no longer complicate reality with resistance. You accept what is. You respond instead of react. You appreciate rather than control. The mind becomes quiet. You no longer live in the past or the future, but in the vivid immediacy of now. Jung said that the self exists outside of time, it is eternal presence. When you align with it, you experience timelessness even in ordinary moments. You find beauty in stillness, meaning in silence, and joy in ordinary things. Washing dishes, walking, or listening to rain becomes sacred because you are fully there. This is what Jung called the numinous, the direct experience of the divine within the mundane. You stop striving for enlightenment because you realize it's not something to reach, it's something to live. Wholeness doesn't separate you from the world, it connects you to it completely. 10. Relationships after integration. When you begin to live as your true self, your relationships transform radically. You no longer seek others to complete you, but to share with you. Love becomes less about possession and more about presence. You attract people who resonate with your wholeness because you no longer emit the frequency of need. The more authentic you become, the more aligned your environment becomes. You no longer chase relationships. They arise naturally through mutual recognition. Jung suggested that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This is the essence of conscious relationships. They don't exist for comfort, but for mutual evolution. Conflict no longer threatens you because you understand its purpose to reveal what still needs awareness. Every conversation becomes an opportunity for growth, every disagreement a mirror for understanding. Love becomes sacred, not idealized, not desperate, but rooted in truth. You can love deeply without attachment and walk away peacefully when alignment ends. 11. The return to the world integration doesn't mean withdrawing from life. It means returning to it fully. Jung warned against staying in the cocoon of introspection. The final task of individuation is to bring consciousness back into the collective, to live your truth among others, to act, create, and serve. You return to the world not as the old self who conformed, but as a conscious being who contributes. You no longer hide behind roles or personas. You live transparently. Your presence itself becomes transformative, not because you preach, but because you embody awareness. Jung described this as the archetype of the wounded healer, the person who, having integrated their own suffering, becomes a source of healing for others simply by being authentic. You no longer need to save anyone. Your wholeness inspires them to find their own. You move through life with humility. You don't feel superior for being awakened. You recognize that everyone is on their own sacred path. You participate in the world without losing yourself in it. 12. The living symbol of rebirth. The process of integration culminates in what Jung called psychological rebirth. It's not about becoming someone new, but about awakening to what has always been within you. Rebirth feels like freedom, not because circumstances change, but because your perception does. The same world now appears alive with meaning. You no longer see life as happening to you, but through you. The self, once a distant concept, becomes a living reality. You sense its presence in your heart, its wisdom, in your intuition, its strength in your stillness. You no longer search for God outside because you feel the divine moving within. This is not a constant high, it's a grounded clarity. You still face challenges, but they no longer throw you off center. You still feel pain, but it no longer erases your peace. Rebirth is not escape, it's embodiment. Jung described it as the emergence of the imago Dei, the image of God within the human soul. When you integrate your opposites, you mirror the divine wholeness of creation itself. The individual becomes a reflection of the cosmos, conscious, creative, and compassionate. 13. Signs you are living as your true self. When you begin living from this integrated state, certain qualities become unmistakable. You live honestly even when it's inconvenient. You no longer explain your boundaries, you embody them. Your happiness is not dependent on external validation. You feel deeply connected to life, people, nature, silence. You experience synchronicity regularly, as if the universe is in dialogue with you. You forgive easily, not because others deserve it, but because peace matters more than being right. You express gratitude spontaneously, not as practice, but as your natural state. You sense purpose not as a goal, but as a way of being. You move through uncertainty with faith, not fear. You live with gentle confidence, not arrogance, not submission, but alignment. These are not achievements, they're expressions of integration. The more aligned you are with the self, the more life flows through you effortlessly. 14. The infinite journey. Even after rebirth, growth continues. Jung emphasized that individuation is a lifelong process. Integration is not static, it deepens endlessly. Every new experience, challenge, or relationship brings another layer of awareness, but now you no longer resist that process. You understand that change is not an interruption, but the rhythm of existence itself. You welcome the unknown because you trust the wisdom of the self. Rebirth doesn't end the human experience, it sanctifies it. You still laugh, grieve, hope, and fail, but now everything becomes part of the divine dance. The sacred and the ordinary merge. The line between psychology and spirituality disappears. You realize that the goal was never perfection, it was participation, to live consciously within the mystery of being, to see with the eyes of wholeness, to love with the heart of awareness. And that Jung would say is the moment the human becomes divine, not by ascending above life, but by embracing it completely. The truth is, outgrowing your old self isn't about becoming someone new, it's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Every time you face your shadow, every time you let go of what no longer serves you, you move closer to your true self, the divine center within. If this video spoke to your soul, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Jungian insights into your transformation journey. You're not losing yourself, you're finally coming home.